So we're back with part two of chapter 24.2, our second uh, in a three-part series on this second half of chapter 24. Such an important chapter um, on the passive voice. Once we have the passive voice down with everything that we've studied so far, we really have come to a good level of being able to understand Greek New Testament when we read it. There are some additional things, the future, the imperative, the present tense of me verbs, that we still need to cover, but these are almost incidental to our main objective, to become familiar with New Testament Greek. And if you are studying diligently, which I trust that you are, you will begin to see more and more results, more fruit of your work on this course. Now, I'm going back to our presentation. We stopped with this slide here in sorry, I didn't have it up and running. Matthew 1, verse 20. I was actually stumped because I didn't review myself just before starting this video by this verb form, enthum methentos, which is an aorist passive participle in thumomai, which means to consider, to think very hard about something, to we say mull it over. And because it is an aorist participle, and then we have afterwards the word behold or look, and it's a noun that it do functions as a word that introduces either a person, a special character who has an important role to play, or in the usually in narrative text, story text that and of course the Gospels are pretty much, there's a lot of narrative within them. There's also teaching, but there's also narrative, story form. And when it do comes before a verb, it is introducing and wants us to pay close attention to the action that is shown by the verb. But when it comes before a person, as here the angel of the Lord, then it is drawing special attention to him. I think it's important here, though, first to see that we have an aorist participle, masculine, singular, enthummethentos, passive voice, aorist passive participle. It looks like we have actually a genitive absolute to begin this verse. After he had considered these things, because we could conceivably use the aorist tense as while he was thinking over these things, but usually the aorist tense in connection with a verb and we have a present tense verb following. So I think we're pretty much forced to consider this as an adverbial temporal participle and translate it after he, autu, is in the genitive case because the subject is in the genitive case when we have a genitive absolute. And remember, genitive absolutes are basically clauses or short statements that come usually at the beginning of a verse or a sentence in the Greek New Testament. And they never use the article, but they have a pronoun or noun in the genitive case, and they have a participle in the genitive case. And that's what we have here. We have tauta, which means is the neuter plural of these things. Now, de is also introducing a new topic, a new subject, and they do a new person. After he had considered these things, is how I think we have to translate this first part. The angel of the Lord, angelos Kyriou, there's no article, but because it's the angel of the Lord, it is definite. So it doesn't need to have the article when it has the genitive and referring to the Lord's angel. There's only one Lord, so we translate in English after he had considered these things. The angel of the Lord appeared, ephane, to him. Sorry, we have an aorist tense. I said present before, but it's not. Kat honor, in a dream, most likely. In a dream, appeared to him in a dream, saying, present tense, draws our attention, moves us forward, because now he wants us to notice the statement, which is typically in the aorist tense. The angel is saying, Joseph, son of David, me phobethes. The aorist passive subjunctive, do not fear. To take, paralabin, the infinitive, to take Mary, your wife, or as your wife, we would say in English, to take Mary, your wife, for tall, that which has been born in her, or has been conceived in her. Genethen can also mean conceive, not just to give birth. For that which has been conceived in her is from the Spirit is holy. Pneumatos estin hagiu. The adjective is in the predicate position. It's describing the Spirit. So we should translate that which has been conceived in her. The child, paidion, an infant, is neuter, so it wouldn't be uncommon to simply refer to the fetus, Jesus in the womb of Mary, as tall, that which. For that which gar has been conceived. Genethen, aorist passive, has been conceived in her from the Spirit is holy. When we have a prepositional phrase, unless there's some special reason, it's articular. That means we don't need the article because it's articular, we say. From the Spirit is holy. hagiu is put last by itself, and it is thus emphasized in the verse. Now, the thing which concerns me here the most, where I think, this subjunctive use of prohibition. We had the use of prohibition back in chapter 16 with the subjunctive. Do not fear, me phobethes. To take Mary as your wife. And phabeomai and is often even its passive voice is, we said back in chapter 9, even though it looks passive, it takes a passive form usually, but it's translated actively. Do not fear. In other words, he's not saying do not be feared, which the passive voice would normally convey. But phabeomai is one of those that we call deponent. It's translated in English as an active voice. Do not fear. So this is the aorist subjunctive. So the ninth use of the subjunctive prohibition, the use of the subjunctive takes the place of the second person aorist. I'm not sure why I put that note in there, so I'll skip on. John 3, verse 7. Do not be amazed, me thaumasthes, hoti epon soi. Do not be amazed that epon, I said to you, it is necessary for you to be born from above. Anothen. Anothen has two meanings. Again is one, and the other is from above. And it's evident that Jesus is talking about being born from above, receiving life from God. And Nicodemus, we say in English, understands him as saying, must be born again. But that's not what Jesus actually means. He means to be given life from above, from God, transformed by God's life. We notice we have the use of the accusative of subject with the infinitive. You may have forgotten this use of the infinitive, but we need to remember it because it is common. It is more common in Luke and Acts and in Hebrews than it is perhaps in, for example, John, but we still have it in John. It is necessary. We would have to say, for you to be born again. Aorist passive, to be born, infinitive, to be born, for you to be born again. And we translate it kind of as almost as an indicative in English, not quite, because in this case we keep the infinitive to be born again, but for you to be born again. It is necessary that you are born again, is another way we could put it, by supplying that. But some way we have to add an additional English word in order to get the sense, to have good English translation of this verse. We have Luke 18:15. Proseferon, That's an imperfect tense. They were bearing to, bringing to um, him. Now they were bringing to him, or they were carrying to him also Chai, Ta Brefe, the infants, in order that he might touch them. And when the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. This verb is strong, epitimao, and it's sometimes used in the sense of punished. They didn't just say, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. They did some kind of action that said, get away. Perhaps even almost physical, to hitting them. And he doesn't want to see these babies. Take your babies home. And Jesus ends up and turns around and rebukes his disciples for doing this. But they were bringing to him, notice now they were bringing, imperfect tense, third person plural, they were bringing to him also the infants in order that he might touch them. Haptetai. And this is a present, middle, or passive. In order that they might be touched by him. Actually, in English, it's hard to make this into a passive when it can be a middle, and I think it is a middle voice here. Jesus is the subject is intensely involved in the action. No, sorry. Sorry to make a mistake again. In order that no, not a mistake. I'm right. He might touch them. He might be touching them. I sometimes get confused, and probably you do too, because we need to use the progressive with the present tense. So he might be touching. He might place his hands upon them. Haptetai. Anahapto. Anahaptetai would be to set on fire. But Jesus is not setting the infants on fire, and it doesn't say anahapto. This says haptetai. But in order that he might touch them, that they might be touched. In order that, third person singular, middle voice, in order that he might touch them. And after they saw this, idontis is an aorist participle. So we might want to translate after, or might want to simply leave it with when the disciples saw this, because it has already happened. So we can say after with idontis, after they saw this. But since it's going on with the imperfect in the start of the verse, pros epheron, they were bringing, since it's continuing action, the disciples began to rebuke them, or were rebuking them, and as when they saw this, after or when is acceptable. with the aorist participle. John 3, verse 7, or the subjunctive, do not be amazed. Thalmases. Because I said to you, it is necessary to be born from above. We had this verse already. One comment here, we used to be taught that prohibitions in the aorist tense mean do not start doing something. But this is not always true. In keeping with the aorist tense of viewing actions as a whole, sometimes prohibitions in the aorist tense prohibit an action as a whole. So not it is very common for a prohibition, a subjunctive use of the prohibition with the aorist tense to mean do not start doing something, and for prohibitions in the subjunctive in the present tense to mean to stop doing something that you've already started. But you cannot make a rule out of this. Even though we were taught 50 years ago, this was a rule. Aorist tense do not start, and present tense stop doing what you're doing. After we had computers and were able to study quickly all of the uses, for example, of the aorist subjunctive and the present subjunctive, we came to the conclusion, that is, the Greek experts came to the conclusion that we can't keep this rule, at least not consistently. For example, I have here Matthew 6, verse 13. And Jesus is making a prohibition with the subjunctive. In a request to God in the Lord's Prayer, do not do not lead us into temptation. Me eis egenes. Lead us not into temptation. So in this case, it would be wrong to say that we are asking, do not start to lead us into temptation, but we are asking as a viewing the action as a whole, being tempted as a whole, the whole sphere or the whole idea of temptation. Please don't let us fall into this place that we are overcome by temptation. Now, I've made a statement on this before in chapel, but the powers that be have not accepted my suggestion. But if you make a word study of eis and perismon, testing or temptation, and also some other words that are used with eis, for example, the one that we just had, do not lead us into temptation, Matthew 6:13. Watch and pray, Jesus says, these are imperative forms actually. Watch and pray in order that you might not enter into temptation. You might not come into temptation. For the spirit, on the one hand, on the one hand, the spirit is willing, Paul Thumon, but on the other hand, the flesh, sarx, asthenes, is weak. Men and de together mean on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, the spirit is willing. On the other hand, the flesh is weak. But notice, to enter into temptation, eis elphen, means to come into something. And I'm going to suggest it means to come under the control of temptation. Now, the thing that I have trouble with is in chapel at FC College, the translation in the bulletin has always been, do not let me be tempted. But this translation cannot be correct, because the Spirit of God leads Jesus into the wilderness for this purpose, in order that he might come into temptation by the devil, but not fall into temptation, not be overcome by temptation, not come under the control of temptation. We will be tempted. So I think it is wrong to pray, Lord, help me not to be tempted. Temptations are always there to sin, but we don't have to sin if we ask him to save us in that moment of temptation. The way which leads into destruction, apoleon, in Matthew 7:13 and 14, and many are those who enter through this gate, talking about the gate, the way which leads into destruction, into the place of destruction. It's leading into a place, it's leading into something that takes control over us. Here, temptation might take control of us. Here, the whole destruction of hell might destroy us. And Jesus is warning. And he says, the way which leads into life, to come under the control of eternal life. And few are those who find it, who are finding it, heuris ontes, the ones who are finding it. Present tense, imperfective action, they are in the process of finding it, of going into it. And thankful today that there is a movement of people to come to the Lord Jesus, and he is calling a people to his own name. Those who are wishing, who are wanting, desiring to become rich, plutein, and an infinitive. Empiptusin, fall into. Pipto is to fall, empipto, to fall into, present tense, are falling into temptation, and pagida and epithemias polos, and many wrong desires. So the desire to be rich is the root of all kinds of evil. That's another verse, but it's essentially saying the same thing. So Paul is warning there in 1 Timothy that Timothy should watch out for Christians who are desiring to become rich. And there are many such Christians in America and in Pakistan. They want to get money. Pastors who want to get money, who don't want to wait on the Lord to provide. And this is a horrible thing, and it is also a thing that misleads us. It brings us under the control of temptation, and we are overcome by temptation. So ace is a kind of movement towards and into something. And that's why I don't like the translation, do not let me be tempted, but rather do not let me fall in temptation. When temptation comes to sin, let me, please, Lord, let me trust in you. so that you can save me out of the trial of temptation. Here's another verse with the passive form. Humes de me klethete rabbi. Now, you should not be called. We have a prohibition with the aorist subjunctive, aorist passive subjunctive. Kaleo and klethete is the aorist passive, second person plural. You should not be called teacher, rabbi. For one is of you the teacher, your teacher. Your teacher is one person, the Lord Jesus himself. And all of you are brothers, adophoi. So be careful, we are told, about making someone into Dr. Herb, Dr. Bob, Dr. Wesley. I don't think this prohibits that. We have to follow the cultures in which we are placed. And but I don't let, for example, in church, Christians call me Dr. Brasher. I don't want that because it separates a person from the others. We are brothers, and we must be careful about these titles. But notice the aorist passive, not be called, not the verb doesn't say you should not call anyone Rabbi. It says you shall not be called. So the action is happening to the person, to Humes. You should not be called by others. So don't let them call you Rabbi, for you are one, you have one teacher and you're all brothers. Now, again, we have here an aorist form of spero in Mark 4:31. This is about the parable of the mustard seed. As a seed of mustard, who, or we would translate in English, which, kokos, the word for seed here, is masculine in Greek, and therefore which is also masculine, hos, agreeing with kokos, although it's in the dative case. In a seed of mustard, we're missing, of course, as verse 30 to get the context for why this is in the dated case. But hos must agree with koko. For when it is sown, notice spero in the aorist tense has changed to spar. This often happens with liquid verbs. Liquid verbs are verbs that stem ends in lambda, mu, nu, or ro. And spero then is one of those. The stem changes from spare to spar, but this is also a passive form, spare, which when it is sown, the action happens to the seed of mustard, the mustard seed, when it is sown onto the earth. The smallest, which of all the seeds, which is upon earth. So it is the smallest of all the seeds which is upon the earth. Jesus was not making a scientific statement. He was making a statement in line with the culture in which he lived. And the culture understood that the mustard seed was the smallest. That doesn't mean that somewhere in South America there weren't seeds that are smaller. Jesus is not here making a class in 21st century botany. He's teaching in the 1st century understanding in Judea. And for them, the smallest seed was the mustard seed. But the main thing to notice here is the aorist passive, which is sown, which when, hoton, when it is sown. We might even say if it is sown, but hoton means when. If you don't sow the seed, of course, nothing happens because the seed doesn't fall into the ground. So again, the action is happening to the subject, which is the seed, the synapelos, the seed of mustard, the mustard seed, the mustard plant, the mustard bush, which produces the herb which we use, mustard, and make mustard from. It is sown. Something happens to it, to the subject, and rather than the subject acting, the action happens in the passive voice to the subject. Now I'm going to go to through all of the verses that I've given here. I have one more thing in this section that I want to include, and I'll use the basics of New Testament syntax from Dr. Wallace. Probably one of the greatest New Testament Greek grammarians in the world today. His Beyond the Basics is, or it used to be, the standard intermediate text. I would say almost intermediate and advanced Greek grammar text, but I like KMP better. KMP has been published 16 years after Dr. Sorry, who did I say? Wallace. After Dr. Wallace, should I say Robbie Wallace, Teacher Wallace? After he produced his grammar 16 years later, KMP produced theirs, and I think theirs is therefore more up to date. It's certainly not as long. And for our purposes, I think, and Dr. Dr. Wesley agrees with me, and he wants me to use this in our Greek courses in a certificate program, because you'll be using that same book in the MPhil program, those of you who go on to the MPhil studies. Very often with the passive voice, there is agency expressed. And usually it is with hupol plus the genitive. We often need an agent with the passive voice. And if we look back at some of the verses that we've just looked at, we would notice that we often have hupol. It's the most common with the genitive, because since the action happens to the subject, we don't know who actually did the action. And that's what we call the agent. There's the ultimate agent. I was hit by John. In other words, John was the one who did the hitting. I am the subject of the sentence. I was hit, but the action happens to me and is done by someone else. Other words that are sometimes used are apo and para, from or by. Now, there can be what's called an intermediate agent. Let's suppose it was done by John by means of or through. He hit me by means of a bat or some instrument. That might be, or usually be dia plus the genitive, through something, by something, by means of something. And then we have impersonal means, in with the dative case, which in that case means water. He was baptized in hudati. He was baptized in water, or baptized by water, or baptized with water. Which is it? Well, it depends on which church you belong to. If you're Baptist, it's in water. If you're maybe Armenian Orthodox, it is, or some Orthodox church, it might be by water. By would imply pouring water. If you're baptized with water, you're probably Presbyterian or Lutheran, because if you're sprinkling the water. So the translation of being baptized by water, which would probably be an intermediate means, because the pastor, or for example, Philip in Acts chapter 8 is the one who baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch. Baptized, I'm not sure if it uses preposition there. I haven't looked, but we can imagine the Ethiopian eunuch was baptized. If that, I'll have to look up the verse. But if the verse is using the aorist tense, it'll be the aorist passive. He was baptized by Philip, by means of water, or in water. I remember do recall the Ethiopian eunuchs ask and request baptism. Look, there's water. How he was baptized really depends on which church you belong to, because how you translate in. It can be in, it can be by, it can be with. You can also have the dative without a preposition. We can have ek with the genitive. So these all appear in the New Testament. Perhaps the most important thing to notice here is that there can be two agents. There can be an ultimate agent, which is usually the person who does something to the subject, and there can be an intermediate agent. The person uses something to carry out that action. And the passive voice, the action happens to the subject. This is from Dr. Wallace. The subject of a passive verb receives the action. That is usually expressed by hupo plus the genitive. Sometimes apo plus the genitive is used, rarely para plus the genitive. Moses was born, or after Moses was born, participle, sorry, after Moses was born, he was hid. Krube, passive voice. He was hid for 3 months by hupo ton pateron autu, by his parents. The preposition indicates that the parents were ultimately responsible for the hiding of the baby. That does not exclude the possibility that others, such as Moses' sister, also carried out the clandestine activity. They did it in secret because Hebrew babies were supposed to be thrown into the river, killed. If the Hebrew baby boys, I mean. So after Moses was born, he was hid for 3 months by his parents. And what he's saying, and they are the ultimate agent, but there could have been other intermediate agents by his parents, who asked his sister to babysit while they went to eat at the restaurant for their anniversary. No, I'm not sure that they did that back in those days. But there still could be, technically there could be an intermediate agent. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. Apo theou perazomai. I am tempted by God. This is actually also a passive form, when he is tempted. No one, when he is tempted, perazomainos, legeto, hoti, that I am tempted by God, or quotation marks, I am tempted by God. Hoti can be that, or it can be also quotation marks, or it can mean because. But because doesn't fit here. Quotation marks fit. I don't want to go any further. This material will be on the presentation if you want to read it further. What Dr. Wallace gives us about the agent. But I want to point out this. It seems a bit odd to native English speakers. Greek sometimes uses an accusative with a true passive verb. The major usage for such a structure involves the accusative of retained object. In this instance, the accusative of thing in a double accusative person-thing construction with an active verb retains its case when the verb is put in the passive. I taught you the lesson becomes with the verb converted to a passive. You were taught the lesson by me. When the verb is transformed into a passive, the accusative of person becomes the subject. The accusative thing is retained. You were taught the lesson by me. Let's take some illustrations. All one spirit, all were made to drink. All is the person put in the nominative with passive verbs. The accusative of thing, one spirit, is retained. If the verb had been in the active voice, the text would be read, he made all to drink of one spirit. But it's in the passive voice. All were made. Epotistemen. All were made. Pontis, all were made to drink hen pneuma of one spirit, to drink one spirit. Hoi telonai baptistentis ta baptisma Ioannu. The tax collectors, hoi telonai. After they were baptized with the baptism of John, I'm going to change the translation here. He has having been baptized, but this is an adverbial temporal participle, very sure. So this is not good to leave this with having been baptized. We should use the aorist temporal adverbial participle after they were baptized with the baptism of John. So this is an example of a passive voice with an accusative object. After they were baptized with the baptism of John, the baptism is what's being used to baptize them with. I think our session has gone on long enough. I want to change from this presentation just to look quickly at our textbooks. And we will do that in our third segment. And look quickly at the forms and outside of the indicative mode for the passive voice, and principal parts, what you should know about principal parts, what you should be learning about principal parts of verbs. That will be our final video segment.